Hello. In today's video, I'm going to talk about why I do the Cadillac 500. This question seems to come up a lot. I understand I seem to know a lot. Why aren't I doing LS's or even the old Gen 1 Chevys, which I've done a lot of. Why the Cadillac? Why are you doing the Cadillac? Well, I really wasn't trying to get into my personal world. I was really trying to talk mostly about how things work and what I've learned. But I did want to touch base on this because it seems to keep coming up. And the story I will try and keep short. But basically, when I joined the Navy at 17, and in my early 20s, I got transferred to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And I needed a car to bomb around in, me, my buddies, have some fun with. And I didn't want to spend a lot of money. And I found a Cadillac Eldorado, 71 Cadillac Eldorado. It had been a rental car. It was being sold pretty darn cheap. It was convertible, big car. You could probably stuff 8 of us in it. I thought it was a good choice for the island. I wasn't trying to go anywhere. It was really just a fun car. It was a little rough. I had to fix the floorboards, and not too long after I had it, the timing chain went out, and I wound up taking the motor out, cleaning it up, not really rebuilding it, but new rings, new bearings, valve job, put it back together, reseal the tranny, front wheel drive, remember, Eldorado. But that was my first exposure to the 500 Cadillac motor. In fact, when I bought the car, I didn't even realize it until I popped the hood and I looked down on the nameplate and it said 500 CID. And I'm like, is that really true? And of course the salesman was like, oh yeah, biggest motor there is. And I had fun with that car. Now remember, I'm in my early 20s. I am in the Navy. I am using it just to play with. And we got around and we did some things, and when I rebuilt the motor, military has a work area called a hobby shop where you can work on your car, and that's where I did it. And I met some guys that were racing, going to the Friday night drags, and I started taking the Eldorado, and eventually it wound up with a hole in the hood and a Predator carburetor and a velocity stack sticking out and nitrous plate on the bottom and slicks. I got another set of rims and put slicks on it, and I kind of felt like a rock star because when I do burnouts, it's front wheel drive, so it's a front wheel burnout, and all you see is flashes going off, and I had fun. Now, was it fast? No. It was okay for what it was. But remember, it's a 6,000-pound car. So I was just having fun, goofing around. At first I thought maybe I'd restore the car, but it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, when I got it, it had lots of sand in it. It was a rental car in Hawaii. I mean, it had problems. Between salt and sand. But eventually I wound up working at the hobby shop because I was ineligible to go to sea. And during that time, actually a bit before that time, my roommate got a 70 Monte Carlo. And he took the 2-barrel off and put an Edelbrock intake and a 4-barrel carb and some headers on it, and and shift kit in the transmission, and some stall converter, and 488s in the rear end, and basically was trying to pretend it was a Chevelle. I mean, remember, this is back in the 80s. Monties were a little cheaper back then. And he wound up messing up the gears in the back, and then ate the tranny, partly because of the gears. And then he bought a Vega that needed an engine, so he pulled the engine out of the Monte Carlo and put it in a Vega, and that's what he was driving. And this car was sitting at the hobby shop with no engine, no transmission, and no rear end, and 38,000 original miles on the odometer. And it was a nice car. And I started harassing him because I was at the hobby shop and told him he had to do something about it. And he literally goes, well, I don't know what to do with it. I said, well, you could always sign the title over to me. And he goes, okay. And the next thing I know, I own a 1970 Monte Carlo with no engine, no transmission, and no rear end. And I call my buddy up, and he runs over to discuss what we can do. And I'm like, well, what engine am I going to use? You know, I don't have a small block available. We'd have to try and find something. And he looks over at the Eldorado and goes, you rebuilt that. He says, that car is going away. He says, but the motor's great. He says, let's put it in. And I was kind of hesitant. I was like, man, that's a big motor. And he's like, the hood's 6 foot long. The Monte Carlo's got room. I was like, well, yeah, okay, you're right. I said, but what are we going to do about a rear end? That could be hard to find. Remember, we are in Hawaii. And so he's like, I'll find a rear end, and you deal with getting the engine and transmission in the car. So I pulled the engine and tranny out of the Eldorado. And remember, I had cleaned up both a while back. I took the transmission, which was a front-wheel drive transaxle, to a transmission shop. And this is back in the early, mid-'80s. And it was a very desirable transmission back then. I mean, because it was only Eldorado, Toronado. And they happily traded me for a BOP Pontiac, basically, because Buick, Olds, Pontiac, Cadillac were the same. And bolt pattern, turbo 400, short tail shaft. And so I had an engine, I had a tranny, I just had to make motor mounts, wound up building headers, had to move the steering a little bit, but it was a pretty easy swap into the car. About that time, my buddy came up with a rear end. Now, the problem is, my buddy is a Ford guy. I'm a GM guy. And I know you wouldn't think we'd get along, but we really did. And he comes up with this Ford 9-inch. Now, this is back in the 80s. You didn't swap that kind of stuff quite so much back then. And I was like, man, I said, I was really hoping for like a 12 bolt. He's like, there's not one to be had on this island. And he's like, the good news is it's the right width, and it has disc brake conversion, and it has gears in it. And he says, it's already been shaved. All you got to do is weld some mounts on it and put it in the car. And so that's what I did. And the Caddy Carlo was born. Now remember, I'm in my 20s. And not doing anything else to the engine that made the car faster, because I lost 2,000 pounds. I went from like 6,000 pound front wheel drive Eldorado to basically about a 4,000 pound rear wheel drive Monte Carlo. And I still have that car. That car has been with me my whole life. And it is still Cadillac powered. And I know a lot of people are like, well, you know so much. You know, why didn't you put a big block in it? Why didn't you swap something else into it? Why are you using that boat anchor? Well, a couple of things. I mean, I was building engines for some other people, But having this Cadillac that's big, I mean it's 500 cubic inches, forced me to learn some of this because I really wanted to know what it took to make it run. And I tried several things, including camshafts, in which case my first call was to Iscadarian Cams to see if they could cut one for the Cadillac 500. The guy put me on hold, and remember, I'm in my 20s, and the next thing I know, I get an answer on the other end of the line after being on hold at Iscadarian. I was like, wow. So I told him what I was doing, that it was much more of a toy, and I was trying to get more out of it. And he's like, oh yeah, I love those engines, and I know just what to do, and I'll grind you a great camshaft. And so he ground me a camshaft, I put it in the car, and it was a little better, but not a lot. And I was somewhat disappointed, and some of the small blocks I was doing, I'd built, a Monza and another Vega for a guy, and I've been doing some other things at the hobby shop while I was there. I contacted a fairly new company that was in the magazines called Cadillac Motorsports Development, Larry Kruzak. And he and I talked for quite a while, and I explained to him what the cam was, and I said, I don't think Ed understood that it's not really in a Cadillac, that I really am trying to make it performance oriented. And Larry reassures me, oh yeah, and I can really do this. I have some real good grinds. And I figure he's doing the Cadillac motor, he knows a little better. So I order a cam from him. And I get that camshaft and I look at the specs. They're not much different than Ed's. And I call him up and I'm like, this cam's almost the same. Oh yeah, but my cam works. It's actually more different than you realize. Well, I put it in, it really wasn't any different. And that's when I started realizing I need to learn a lot more about cams. And I need to learn a lot more about how things work. I told you in one of my previous videos, one small block I did was really, really good. The next one not so much so. So I was trying to refine that part too. And I kept going with the Cadillac because I wanted to make it work. Now, shortly after this, I got medically discharged from the Navy. The reason I couldn't go to sea. They're like, you know what, you're not going to be any help to us. We're going to send you home. And so I brought that Monte Carlo with me. It took quite a bit to make it happen, but I brought it back from Hawaii, and it became my daily driver. In fact, the first thing I had to do, because it was shipped to Seattle, was drive it from Seattle to Albuquerque in order to get home. And it did wonderful. In the process, I also stopped and talked to Larry Kruzak some more, because he was in California at the time, and saw what he was doing with some of the Cadillac stuff. Now, that's about when I learned that Larry was actually a sailboat guy, not so much an engine guy. And so I kind of kept working on it and figuring it out, and I built some different motors. It was a toy still. I wound up getting another little car to kind of get around in, so the Monte Carlo was really a toy. And I tried different engines, some of them much better built, supercharged, nitrous. At one point I was at 800 horsepower and 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. I promptly ripped the pinion right out of the 9-inch rear end. Had to rebuild all that. So I just kind of kept going. Of course, I was on all the message groups that were back in the day about the Cadillac and learning more about how engines work. I had my flow bench. I was porting heads. I ported my Cadillac heads. I got it running really pretty good. And I ran into Courtney. Courtney Hines had a business here in town, and he specialized in repairing old Cadillacs and general maintenance. Later he got into more fleet maintenance. But he always loved the Cadillac, and he had a Cadillac that he raced called Flash Cadillac. And when I first met him, I was at the track. Now, I've been figuring out how things kind of work. And I'd actually converted the Monte Carlo to manual transmission with a Cadillac 500. It was a fun car. And I was out on one of the races and did my run. And remember, we're at 7,000 foot, but it was a very reasonable run. I was down in the 12s, which at sea level would be about an 11. And he comes up, and the first words out of Courtney's mouth were, "What the hell are you shifting at?" I told him, 6,500. They don't make any power up there. Well, mine did. His full-blown race car on alcohol with a tunnel ram was done at 5. That's because I was already starting to get a good handle on how some of this works. And I was porting heads, and I knew what was what. So that's when he and I kind of met and started hitting it off because we had a common interest. Now, to keep the story fairly short, I mean, there's years of me playing around. I mean, there has been a bunch of different Cadillac motors in it. Keep learning things. I blew up one with too much nitrous, which I blame a company for that I got the kit from because their solenoid didn't flow enough. But it was a good motor. I was a little unhappy about that. So I switched to doing some stock motors and seeing how much I could get out of them, and just kind of kept playing. Of course, at this point, I have a house, a family, and job, and you can only do so much. So I kept working on the Cadillac, and I never gave up on it, and I learned a lot. Now, as we get into just a few years back, Richard Holdner decided that he was going to do a Cadillac on one of his videos. And a friend of mine was a big fan of him, mostly because it was LS and we're getting bigger into LS stuff. And he's like, "You need to get involved. You know a lot about these." Well, I know a lot about them, but Courtney had the facilities. He had bought out several of the Cadillac companies because he loved what it was. And there was originally 3 companies that made performance parts for the Cadillac, and he wound up buying out all 3 as they gave up on what they were doing. And that's where Cadco came from. And so I went down and got him involved, and come to find out that he knew people that did Westech, and of course Westech knew Richard Holdner, and so we managed to arrange it to where Richard was coming down to the dyno here, and you can see all those videos. And I joined in on that, and one of the things that I did was on one of the engines we put together, I really wanted it to sing. And we were doing a much more built-up aftermarket heads, better intake, and I was like, we can make this engine really something. And so I got it all together on the dyno because, like I said, I was helping out. And as I stepped out of the dyno, I told Courtney, 7,000 RPM, here we go. Now remember, this is a 500 cubic inch Cadillac, 4.3 inch stroke. And him and Richard kind of giggled, and he does a pull on it to about 5,000 RPM. I look over and I'm like, "What are you doing? What happened? Something go wrong?" And he goes, "No." I was like, "Well, you're not even up at peak yet." I said, "Push that puppy up." I said, "I wasn't lying." And so he does another pull, and this one's probably like 62. And I'm still looking at him. I was like, you're not even, the engine hasn't peaked yet. Now, the engine wound up peaking about 65. There is video of this 7,000 RPM engine on Richard Holdner's page under Cadillac. If you look for the playlist for Cadillac, there's one with a 7,000 RPM Cadillac engine. And I got him to pull it to 7, and he's like, holy smokes. And I'm like, have you not been up there with one of these engines? And he goes, no, never. I didn't even know you could do it. And that's when I realized I was getting a much better handle on how they worked than a lot of guys out there. I'd been building some engines. I built one 500 horsepower small block Chevy iron head. Seemed like a nothing motor, but made 500 horsepower, and people seemed amazed by that. He actually wound up going to Nebraska, dynoed it there, and they were a bit flabbergasted at what it made, because it seemed like it was nothing. And I started getting a reputation for some of this, and I was doing other engines. Now, don't think I only do Cadillac. I have done all sorts of things. Now, I tend to be a GM guy, so small block Chevy is certainly way up on the list in lots of them. In fact, one shop I worked at, that's basically all we did until I was sick of doing small block Chevys. We did sprint car motors, we did dirt track motors, we did hot street motors, but they're all basically similar small block Chevys. And I didn't really like that. Another shop I worked at, I liked a lot. We did everything that nobody else wanted. The rarest thing I probably have built is a 1919 Bugatti Duesenberg aircraft motor. That's 2 straight 8s on a common block with a gear drive and a center prop shaft. It was really something different to build. But I have done radial aircraft motors, I've done single cylinder air compressor motors, 4-cycle single cylinder. I've done diesels. The one shop I worked at, like I said, we did everything nobody wanted. Lamborghini, Ferrari, I mean, any of the stuff. I did a whole bunch of heads for oh, no, I can't think. We'll move on. But, so don't think I'm just doing Cadillac. I've had exposure to a lot of things. One of the ones I was very proud of in that shop is I built a flathead Ford. And the guy brought it in, it was way rough, and I had to like get out 11 head studs he broke. I mean, it was a mess. And I got the whole thing built, and I had my flow bench. I kind of understood air. I had ported things a little bit and worked on the head just a little bit where it flows up in, and chose a pretty good cam. I was getting pretty good at some of this, and sent the engine off, and shortly after that, the boss brings this guy back and he says, "This is the guy you built the flathead for." He says he wants to talk to you. And I'm like, oh God, something happened. And he goes, "I would just want you to hear him. That's the damn best running flathead I've ever had. That thing's great." And so, like I said, I've had experience on a lot of different things. So don't think that the Cadillac 500 is it. Now, shortly after we did some of those videos with Courtney and Richard Holdner, I started helping out a little bit more on engine design and some of the stuff down at Cadco. And Courtney and he'd call me up and bounce things off of me and what I thought, and so I was becoming a bit more involved. And then I started going down there a little more because his health was failing. He was older than I am. And just about the time we were really getting close and making things happen, and I was really helping out more, helping tune some cars, fix some problems that showed up on the dyno. He passed away. And so I knew a lot about the Cadillac, nobody else did. He had this whole piece of business that was about making the Cadillac work. And so I started going down on a regular basis to try and get them up to speed so they could run this business and not have it go under. Because I also like the Cadillac, and I like the Cadillac guys. And so I didn't really want it to just go away. And like I said, Courtney had collected up all the companies that did it, and so if his goes away, there really was nothing left. And so I've been trying to keep that going. Now, my health since my 20s has not been great. And so it's more me helping out as I can, not a full-time job where I'm there every single day, every single hour. There is a new owner, he runs it. There is good employees. If something comes up, they call me. So I'm technically probably more of a consultant. I do some hands-on. I like the dyno. I've had to fix the dyno. You know, a lot of things that come up where they get a little stuck, I go get them unstuck. But that's why I keep bringing up Cadco and what they do. And a lot of the dyno tests I've shown were either from Richard, which I did some of those early ones. Some of them are my own, though a lot of my own are done at the rear wheel as opposed to an engine dyno. And trying to show how this stuff works, because as I've gotten older and my health has failed, and I watched somebody that I cared about pass away, I realized I need to try and pass this information on. Not necessarily about the Cadillac. I mean, at this point, the last 500 was made in 76, so we're talking 50 years ago. It is technically an obsolete motor, but everything that I learned really applies to any engine. It's not unique to anything. And the Cadillac 500 is a very interesting engine. I know some of you might consider it a boat anchor, is what it's typically called, but it's actually a very lightweight casting. Other than the intake manifold that weighs 45 pounds, the basic weight of the 500 is about that of a small block Chevy. And I didn't even realize that at first. When I built the Monte Carlo, I put in big block springs because I'm thinking a big motor. Well, the car sat way up in the air. One of the very first things I had to do was jack it back up, take those springs out, put the small block springs back in. Because those engines just don't weigh that much, but you have a lot of cubic inches. And I have spent a lot of time learning what it takes to move enough air to feed that kind of cubic inch displacement and make some real power. Get it to RPM. And part of my playing to make that happen is how I learned how everything goes. Now, I also did it because a lot of the engines I build for people, I want to do really well, and I needed to plan ahead. And like I said, there was a good time period in there where I was doing a lot of headboarding. I had a flow bench, I knew what I was doing, and the question kept coming up. I need to know where I'm going to sit with this. And so I had to figure out how that went. And that's the information I'm actually trying to present in this particular YouTube channel. Not so much about my personal history or my personal life, but I thought I might tell you. I mean, basically I got into the Caddy by accident, and I've just stuck with it for decades. And of course, in those decades, I learned a lot about the engine, what year did what combination of parts, what kind of works. You know, I understand a lot of what Cadco needed, which is how I wound up having to help out Courtney and now just Cadco to keep it going. So that's how and why it's the 500. I still like it. It's a good engine, especially for the street. Cubic inches are hard to ignore if you can feed them. And so it's high nickel block. It doesn't have a lot of part support, but you can pretty well do. It's certainly more expensive, certainly got harder as it's gotten older. You know, I now know how some of the flathead guys felt when I was busy selling parts for small blocks, Fords, 5.0s, all that. You know, it seemed like, oh man, old flathead. Well, now I'm that guy. You know, oh geez, it's that old Cadillac. You know, because everybody's moved on to LS and whatnot. But like I said, what I'm trying to present works out well for all of those, and that's how I'm stuck with the 500. It's something I know a lot about in addition to building engines. I've always had a good skill I started out at 14. I had to build my first engine for my first car. It overheated twice getting home. It was a mess. And if I was going to have a car at 15 when I could get my license, I had to make it work. None of my family did engines. I am the only one. I've always seemed to have a bit of a gift for mechanical stuff. I just kind of know how it goes. And so learning some of this has taken me quite a while, but I'm presenting it hopefully well enough that it shouldn't take you that long to figure out that this actually works and it's really how they go. So that's this basic video, a little bit of history of me, why I do the Cadillac. Don't think that's the only thing I've done. I've done turbo Fords, I've done LS's, I've done turbo LS's, I've done lots of small block Chevys, Pontiacs, Buick 455, Cadillac, and then a bunch of obscure things. Jaguar was that head. I did lots and lots of Jaguar heads. At one point we were doing all of the heads for the Jaguar dealership. And so I wound up doing a bunch of those, and I don't want to do any more of those. They were not very good. So that's how it goes. I wish you luck on your projects. I don't think we need to go into too many of my stories. Certainly don't need to get into any of my Navy stories, but I did learn a lot working about a year and a half at the hobby shop. We had 140 stalls and 140 projects and guys coming in all the time, and we had to make things work. I got to see a lot of mistakes. I also did a big long stint, almost 11 years at a speed shop, making sure things work, people got what they needed, they understood how things went. So that's where I've gained a lot of my experience, along with working at various machine shops. I self-taught CNC because one shop that I was working at was going to CNC, and so I learned it and made it work. Like I said, another one I had to kind of part ways with. I just got sick of doing small blocks. It was just the same thing over and over and over again. There was no joy. The shop I really liked, unfortunately, the owner had a massive coronary and passed away, which wound up shutting down that shop. And that was a very sad day. That was a very enjoyable shop. We did so many different things, I can't even start to name it all. Every time I turned around, it was something new. And we could do everything. We ground cams, we did heads, we welded cranks, we did aircraft certification, we had the FAA come in for stuff. We did lots of stuff. It was a really fun place to work, and I was sorry to see it go. But that's a little bit of my history, and a little bit about the 500, and hopefully this didn't bore you too much. I don't think we need to do a lot of these videos, but leave me a comment. I do try and look at the comments and keep up to date, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.